just one box. Or is it? All those cubic inches taken up by just those cubic inches. Kind of gave me the inspiration for my next project. Check it out. Yeah. It's another table. See what I did here? Yeah. Cubic feet instead of square feet. Yeah. It's going to be fun. Built this out of the remaining steel from the steel that we built this one out of. And going to take you through the process of how I turned all this construction grade lumber into this giant 64-inch by 64-inch table. It's massive. It's 48 inches tall, and this is not all we have planned for it. Stick around and find out why I built this ginormous table. There's a purpose. Stick around. Have some fun.
All right, guys. So we're going to try this voiceover thing. Now you can see here I've got my setup for processing this builder grade lumber into the tabletop. I've got my setup for my dust collection right there and my planer on the table. We're going to be getting to those in a second. First thing we're going to do is try to get a straight edge on these 2x8s. So I broke out my table saw sled, and the whole thing with this is we're using the straight edge of this shelving board to basically give us a straight edge to run along the fence. So you take the 2x8, clamp it into the jig, and muscle this thing over. It's all pretty heavy. It's a little bit awkward, but it ended up working really well. Just trying to get the workflow down was a little tough, but riding that sled along the fence of the table saw, and the whole goal is to just take off as little as possible and give you one solid straight edge all the way along that board. And we'll use this later to put that straight edge up against the table saw fence and cut it all down into strips that we can glue together. And then we just unclamp it, put it on the completed list or completed pile, grab another board, and continue on. Now this was 20 boards I started with because I wanted to make sure I had enough that I could pick and choose all the good strips. I knew there was going to be ones with really bad curves and bows and knots and cracks and stuff like that. So I went ahead and bought 20 2x8s and broke them all down. And this is the first step in breaking them down, is getting that straight edge. All right, now the next step is to get a single flat face on these boards. So what I've got here is what I would call a planer sled, and basically it's a shelving board, and I've screwed a lip on the front side of it. So as that planer pushes on the lumber, it catches that lip and drags that shelf along with it. So what this is essentially doing is the same thing as the table saw sled, and it's using the flat face of that shelving board to ride along the base of the planer and let the cutters cut in a straight path. So what I'll do is I'll get one edge flat on each one of these boards, and then I will flip them over and run them through the planer again to get a parallel side. These faces right here will end up being the glue faces, and so having a straight edge on both sides is pretty important here. It was a considerable amount of time, and I knew it would be, and I factored that in. This is not a table that was built overnight. It took many, many days, just putting 1 or 2 hours in at a time to do this. But there's a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge that I gained by building all this by myself. Now the next step with breaking all this down is I'm going to take each one of those 2x8s that I now have a straight edge on one side and a flat face on one side, and I'm going to ride that straight edge up against the fence, and I'm going to break these down into smaller strips. Now what these smaller strips are, the width of these smaller strips is actually going to become the thickness of my table. So instead of having a tabletop that's 1.5 inches thick, I'm taking these 2x8s and I'm cutting them into 3 different sections, and they ended up coming off the table saw right here at a little over 2 inches. And bam. Yep, we figured that out. That was the first run though. I ended up getting the workflow down pretty good, and this did take a little while to do. I mean, it's 20 boards, cutting each board 3 times, so 60 cuts across the table saw. Yeah, it was time consuming. It made a grand mess in my yard, but I did it there for a couple reasons. I ended up just spreading that sawdust into my yard and hoping it will help my yard hold some water, and but it all worked out good. Since I started with that one straight edge, I can carry that straight edge along the fence and end up with a straight edge on all of my sides. Now those straight edges are the top and the underside of the table, and those flat faces that I use the planer on will be the glue surfaces that glue all these strips together. Now this table is going to be 64 by 64, and if you do the math, 20 1.5 strips, or 20 boards, 1.5 strips, 60 strips, that's way bigger than 64 inches. So the reason I did 20 boards is because I knew there was going to be some knots in these boards. Some of these strips I was not even going to be able to use, and it worked out just like that. Yep, I had way too many strips, but it worked out good because I was able to pick and choose the straightest ones, the best ones to glue together. And as you can see, the mess starting to build up, all those strips coming off, and that huge pile of sawdust underneath the table saw. It really was quite the mess. But finally got the workflow down. Ended up not taking too long to do this. Probably only took me about an hour to cut all these down. And there you can see the huge pile of sawdust that this process made. But it worked out well. I just took my blower and blew it all over across my yard, and hopefully that'll just become dirt and feed the soil. Now the next process for this is going to be gluing up these strips into panels. I ended up trying to keep these panels at just under 13 inches. So that allows me to run it back through my planer. My planer is the DW75, 375, 735. I don't know. The DeWalt planer with a 13-inch max width. So I was trying to keep everything under 13 inches. So everything's just under 13 inches, and with five panels, it all worked out pretty well. Here I dry fit everything to make sure that any curved strips I can get rid of and not use them. And then, some of these do have a slight bow to them, but I wanted to dry fit them and make sure they're all turned in the most optimal way to use the clamps to get that bow out of it. And then I spread the glue out evenly as possible. I'm using what's called a brayer here. I think this is actually like an ink brayer for like printing or something like that. It worked out pretty good. I'm still searching for the best way to spread glue out. I don't know. It's just I almost feel like the best way to do it is just put gloves on and wipe it around with your hands. But this did end up working pretty good. It's just one more thing to clean up when you get done. And I'm just putting a liberal coating of glue on all those surfaces, and then we'll rotate it and clamp it up. I really do enjoy doing this kind of stuff. This is the largest glue up I've ever done. I've done a couple tables, a workbench, couple workbenches and stuff, but this 64 by 64 inch glue up is by far the largest one I've done. And it was pretty intimidating, but when you think about it, it's just multiple small panels. So if you can glue up a small table, you can glue up a big table, right? You can glue up, in this case, 5 small panels, plane them all down, get them all smoothed out, and then glue those together, and you have a huge table. Now, this is one thing I can say about gluing up panels. Starting with these clamps on the side to keep everything straight is one of the best tricks I've learned. And those cauls right there, I ran through the joiner and got them nice and straight, and then put packing tape on them so the glue wouldn't stick. And now I just clamped them down, not a ton of pressure on them, just enough to keep everything on the same level. And now I'll start adding in the clamps to clamp those together, all those strips together. These are the Harbor Freight parallel clamps, and they worked really good on this, but after 6 panels, I was using it the other day, and it's actually having some problems. So I'm gonna go test out that lifetime warranty they have on these, but they worked great. Tons of pressure, and if they honor this lifetime warranty, I'm probably gonna buy a couple more. And you'll probably also notice that I've got clamps all on the top and none on the bottom. What I'm using is the table, how straight that table is, and let the weight of all that wood stay flat on that table. And then with those F clamps, I have some that are impacting at the top side of the panel and some at the bottom side to kind of keep the twisting out of it. And then here we are taking apart a panel, and so this all worked out pretty good. And you'll actually see in this panel, I've actually laid down a piece of parchment paper underneath the panel to keep the glue from sticking to the table. Now originally I did use paste wax on the table, on that melamine table, and to keep glue from sticking, and it worked pretty well, but it was still a pretty good mess to clean up. And I found that putting that parchment paper down, that the glue doesn't stick to it. All I have to do is kind of move it around a little bit, and the dried up bits of glue kind of just fall off of it, or either go with the panel itself. So it was a definite improvement using that parchment paper to protect the surface of the table. And now for a little bit of the metalwork. So this is a pallet rack that I actually got out of a scrap bin. And this is basically the same process as the little table. If you watch that video, building the 48 by 48 table, and basically cut everything down, cleaned everything up, cut it all to size, and here I am just cleaning up all the welds and the corners. I try to radius all my corners. There's nothing worse than every time you grab a table or you're working on a piece that you get cut. It's annoying. I'm not a big fan of gloves. So I'm going to speed this process up since I showed it in so much detail on the 48 by 48 table. But essentially we have 4 legs and 2 sides are welded together, and then 2 stretchers that bolt on. Here I am here just cleaning up the 2 legs, and then there's 1 stretcher that's going to get welded on, laying right there on the floor. So clean it up, get everything squared up, and then go to welding. And I'm just going to tack everything in, and then get it all squared up, and then burn it in, and then a lower stretcher on the bottom for support. So this will be the side. I'll have 2 of these panels, and then the stretchers that bolt on will come across the front and the back. This creates a feed through so that small table or anything else will be able to slide and index underneath it. These 2 stretchers here are going to get bolted on. So I've got everything clamped in place, squared up, and now I'm just drilling the holes for the hardware. And now everybody's favorite part, sanding and cleaning up. Sanding on this took forever. I used sandpaper, wire brush, and I also used Restore Rust Remover. I tried the gel. I had a really bad experience with that gel. It kind of crystallized and was really hard to get off. I ended up having to pressure wash it all off and then hit it all with a wire brush again, and I probably won't be using that again. I've had pretty good success out of the liquid stuff, but that gel just did not do well. Now back to the wood. Here we've got the panels that we've glued up, and I'm using that shelving board again as a planer sled to just run them through and get that one side smooth and flat. These panels were kind of heavy at this point, so it was kind of hard maneuvering them into that planer and keeping everything straight. But again, I did set up a pretty good workflow. I've got 2 stacks beside me so that I could transfer them over. As I did it, I put it on one stack. And that's going to be important when I start doing these second sides here, because I want to run each one through the planer and adjust the height, run them all through again, so that all my panels are the same thickness. And basically we just ran them through over and over again. Once I got them finished, I used a doweling jig and drilled some dowels along the edges so that the edges would go together and not try to pull apart and give me a ridge on the top. Gluing up a big panel like that is just it makes it easier to have those dowels keep it aligned. They're not really there for structure. All the glue and clamping force holds these panels together. The doweling jig is just there for alignment, so this will align them and keep them square on that top surface. And then again with the glue and the brayer, and these panels at this point are so heavy and they're really flat. The planer and everything worked out really well, so there wasn't too much trouble actually getting these panels lined up. And I should note too that at this point these are not cut to length yet, so it doesn't really matter how much the edge is lined up at this point, because they're longer than 64 inches, and then when they're all put together they're wider than 64 inches when all those panels go together. So I just broke it down into sections, glued up 2 panels to make one big panel, and I ended up with 2 large panels and 1 middle panel, I believe. Here's the frame all assembled, sanded, and painted. Went with the same blue color from the 48-inch table. And getting this thing all squared and bolted together, because I'm going to need it, because I don't have a table big enough to put these panels on to do the final glue up. So the only thing I could think to do was to get the frame assembled and then set the panels top of that and use that surface as the glue panel. So 3 large panels all getting glued together, and here, well, you gotta think 64 inches. I did not have a clamp that was big enough for 64 inches, so I actually had to go and buy pieces of pipe to go on for my pipe clamps. And these pieces of pipe that I've got are 6 foot long, and they barely fit because these panels are all oversized, because I wanted to get them all together and then be able to cut it down square to the exact size. So a little bit of miscalculation on my part. I just thought that 6 foot was going to do it, and then I got these things slid together and was almost messed up when I just about couldn't get these 6 foot pipe clamps on there. But we got all the glue into the seams with the dowels, lining them up, keeping that top surface square. I got a little bit of glue on the frame, but no big deal. There was no other, I didn't have any other flat surface to do it on. I've tried gluing things up on the floor of the garage, And no matter what the floor of a garage looks like, it is not flat. I mean, there's some good people, people really good at construction, but no matter what you can do, it is really hard to get concrete to a flat surface. So using the metal structure of the table turned out to be the best thing. And there's a lot of weight in these panels too. So here I'm just using that pipe clamp to get all those dowels pushed in on those two panels, because with the weight of those panels and then the friction from the dowels, it was just not happening. Moving on to the seam of the next panel, and this was a huge glue up, super intimidating, and eventually I was just like, all right, well, I'm just gonna have to do it. If it messes up, I'll go from there and fix it. But it ended up working out really well. I was super surprised at how square, how flat everything stayed. And there's the wife and kids checking in, fussing at me on their way to the pool. This was kind of tough getting these dowels lined up. And this is where I found out that the pipe clamp just wasn't quite big enough. I actually had to unscrew that end to like the very last thread and pull on it as hard as I can just to get it barely to fit on. Just barely got that pipe clamp on. It's like one thread holding it on. But that one thread was just enough to pull it all together. Definitely learned my lesson and should have done put it all together dry to make sure all my clamps fit. Then I would have realized that it was too wide and could have cut a couple of those panels down to give me some room. Alright, so speeding this thing up. Basically, we got it all clamped down and just had to wait for it to dry. I was pretty nervous at this point, hoping that it wasn't gonna curve on me. So the only thing I could think to do was find some straight sticks, and you can see, so these are some of the 2-inch strips that I had left over, and you can see when I put that on there, it was quite curved from those pipe clamps pulling on the top. So I used that and then some clamps on the bottom to pull those edges down, put as much pressure on it as I could to try to bring that thing straight. Now with all the clamps on and those two cauls kind of pulling down, I decided that I was going to go ahead and run some screws in the bottom, since I had already drilled the holes for the railing. So I put a couple screws in the railing in there, through the railing to pull down, and then also threw some weights on there to push down on those edges to try to keep it all flat as possible, and hope everything worked out. We'll see.
Well, gentlemen, here it is. A ginormous 64 by 64 inch roll around workbench. I skipped a few steps after the massive glue up. Didn't do anything special. All I did was take the clamps off, trim it to size, and then I lag bolted it down from the underneath. And I am currently putting some polyurethane over the top of it to just to protect it, harden that that soft pine a little bit, give it something to protect it. But that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm sure you're asking yourself, what in the world did I build this giant table for? Well, two reasons. One reason for something that's going on top of it, and the other reason so that this smaller table would nest all the way up under it, and I would be able to slide this table up against here and use some of that vertical space in the garage instead of square footage. I'm trying to fill up cubic foot, not square foot. So it works well. This workbench nests underneath, and eventually I have some other projects planned for this. So the other table, it comes in right about here to it, so 36 inches. This is right at 48 inches. Eventually, I'm going to come across here, these holes that are already drilled, and I'm going to put a support here and a support across the back and a support through the middle, and then I'll be able to fit half sheets of plywood up underneath it, and that is strategic for what's going on top of this thing. And I guess it's about time we get to that. What's going on top? Well, let me show you. These two boxes. Yep, that's right. I built this whole table just to hold these two boxes. Now, you might think I'm crazy. They're nice boxes. And you want to see what's in them, click this video over here and check it out. All right. Look forward to seeing you on the next one. If you like what you saw, hit that like button. Maybe even consider subscribing. If you didn't like what you saw, tell me about it in the comments. See you guys on the next one.